No, there was originally in our program a fourth presenter in this panel, like in the other panels, who was to be John Monteiro, and who died tragically in Brazil not very long ago, and who had already arranged to be with us today. He taught at there in Sao Paulo, Campinas, I think, for a number of years, and in fact was well known by many for his work on indigenous peoples in Brazil. So we thought that since this is a conference not just to celebrate this, but also of remembrance, that we should use the time that he would have presumably spent giving his paper to remember him. I mean, I know that there are a number of generations of students here, and he was among the earlier ones, so certainly not all of us know him. So I've asked Dane Borges, who did know him, to open this moment with a brief remembrance of John, and then to open up the floor for anyone who knew him. And I know there's some people here who are visiting at Chicago this year from Campinas and who were his students, and so anyone who wishes to say something could do so now. Dane?
Well, I'm not here to give a speech. Many of you know John better than I did. He was from the Midwest, of Portuguese ancestry, made his way to Chicago, and among Mexicanists did the right thing, studied Brazil. Actually, many of that cohort worked on frontiers, on encounters between Indians and others, and several of you worked in South America. His dissertation, finished in 1985, had the perfect Katz Coatsworth title. No sexy first title. It was simply Sao Paulo in the 17th Century, Economy and Society. And by the way, there's stuff in that dissertation which didn't make it into his book, and it's still well worth consulting. He wound up making his career in Brazil, and was an integral participant in a study that Manuela Carneiro da Cunha, our emeritus colleague in anthropology, helped to organize and edit. Of silence about the history of Indians in Brazil. They could have a culture, they could be subjects of ethnography, but it was necessary to have this volume to really, and it had to be big and heavy, and it had to be exhaustive, encyclopedic. In that volume, John wrote the essay on the Guarani, not the main subject of his research. And a year later, in 1994, published his monograph, Negros da Terra, Blacks from Here, or Blacks of this land, as opposed to the Blacks from Guinea, about the development of Sao Paulo, of the Indian slave trade in South America, and the protagonism of the Paulistas in that, of the early development of slave plantation agriculture in Sao Paulo, based in wheat rather than sugar, and leading to a great concentration of wealth in the hands of the gristmill owners. And John continued then to be a leader in making the history of Indians in Brazil a legitimate topic. He contributed in English the essay on the Tupi, or the essay on indigenous peoples in 16th century Brazil, in the most recent Cambridge History of the Native Peoples of South America. That is the third iteration of that, published in 2008. In everything that he wrote, you can feel John fighting for his frustratingly incomplete, with sources that are contradictory, with sources that were produced by interested people who are deliberately obfuscating things as simple as boundary lines. No one really can figure out what the size and scope of political societies was in the South American coast at that time, in part because of deliberate obfuscation in the sources. And so one of his epic battles in his work as a historian was just to work on categories, names, to try to get not clarity, but a little less confusion, a little less uncertainty in figuring out language groups, culture groups, and maybe even polities on the South American coast. That led him into a higher level of struggle over the sources, which was a long, angry conversation with the foundational 19th century historians of Brazil. Varnhagen, other historians, many of them from Sao Paulo, who had deliberately created a legend of Sao Paulo and its heroism that he thought was based on silencing the reality of Indian slavery, on turning very sordid expeditions into heroic ones, and into compressing, redefining, and sometimes defining out of existence peoples who were inconvenient to the patriotic myth of Sao Paulo. And so a secondary theme of his research, which had started very much as political economy research on Sao Paulo, was racial ideologies in Brazil. Look, I think that nobody can live in the city of Sao Paulo without feeling something like revolutionary hatred. And I think the form that it took for John was this deep critique of the way in which racist ideology had erased Indians from Brazilian history. And so with his wife, Maria Helena Pinheiro Toledo Machado, who's a historian of slavery and abolition in Brazil, while they were visiting at the David Rockefeller Center at Harvard, they edited William James' letters from the famous Agassiz naturalist expedition to Brazil. William James was along in part kind of as a draft dodger. The family were glad it would get him out of the Civil War. He was still very much in the process of becoming William James. He was just a callow Harvard undergraduate. But the letters are marvelous letters in which you see somebody shedding bigotry. It didn't hurt that when William James arrived in Rio de Janeiro, he was blinded by smallpox and had to lie in bed and listen for a couple of months before he started to look at Brazil. So John and Maria Helena edited and translated and produced a gorgeous bilingual edition of the William James letters, which is just part of John's work on the sources that we have for the early history of Brazil, for 16th century Brazil, and the ways in which that intersects the 19th century racist historiographies. While we were organizing this conference here, John was killed in a traffic accident, and hearing Jeremy talk about risk and uncertainty, it's hard to feel that a traffic death in Brazil is just risk. I mean, it's a kind of fate connected to patterns of what's a public health issue of neglect for public safety, and we've lost him, but I think that people closer to him suffered a great loss. When he died, he was, I guess, Dean of Social Sciences at the Unicamp, that is, director of the Faculty of History and Social Sciences. And I had the fortune to have two of his students here, Soraya Dornelles and Karina Mello. It was certainly sad news, but it's hard to get over the anger at such a senseless death of such a good comrade. So I just want to remember John. I know we're thankful for what he did, and we were lucky to have him among us.
So, as I said before, and clearly there's no expectation, but if anybody wishes to add anything to what we just heard, please go ahead. Paul?
Chris Jones and I were contemporaries of John here. I don't know if anyone else was in the room, but he was, I took the liberty, by the way, of getting together some old photographs of John. There's some other people looking very, very young. But I didn't really know much about John's scholarship, to tell you the truth. We were all very close as friends here during graduate school. But the one thing I wanted to say, almost paraphrasing, is about John the man. What he was most appreciated for while we were students, in a place that was oftentimes derided as the place where fun goes to die, John was a very upbeat, funny, absurdist kind of person who brought everybody's spirits always up. He was always the person who had the most, who generated the most fun and the most humor among us all over here. And I think that if you were there during that time, that was really an important point.
John Montero came to the University of Chicago from Colorado College, which is now, as it was then, well known as a party place. So he had some reputational difficulties to get over in the admissions committee. But he'd sent along a writing sample that was so well constructed, and his GRE scores and everything else you'd need to get into the University of Chicago were so outstanding that we had to let him in. And we never regretted it. I certainly didn't. He was a joy to work with. I had a tendency to pull out my editor's pencil as soon as I saw anybody's dissertation chapters coming my way. And I have to say, his was the most frustrating experience I think I ever had at Chicago. I had my pencil in my hand poised to rewrite cumbersome sentences, and I couldn't find one. And I couldn't even find a misspelling, at least one that I could recognize. The dissertation was just brilliant. And the career that he had afterwards, after he left Chicago, and his impact in Brazil was just extraordinary. So it's a huge loss.
I wanted to thank Dave a lot for bringing us up to date about what John accomplished. I'd like to. I'm grateful that the last memory of John is not John Montero and Paul Gutenberg ending a party downing shots of Jack Daniels. Those were the fun times, but John and I were both working on frontiers and what is now called ethnohistory, and we tried very much not to use that because it was going to be a tendency to marginalize the whole question. And I just wanted to point out about those early years when he was doing that. It was already sort of shocking in North American history that people were just starting to discuss taking American Indians as having history at all. Just to go back to 1976 is the year that they were publishing all kinds of coffee table books of the ahistorical Indian. That's how the Indian was treated in all of the literature. And so John and I had a lot of, because I worked on downriver Paraná, we talked about those frontiers. And so I want to thank Dane again for sort of bringing the intellectual history forward. And it always was, the last time I got to see John was when he was here 6 or 7 years ago on campus, and to hear him talk about his life, and glad to see him. It was a big shock for those of us who knew him. We were all on the phone the same day, and we miss him.
I want to say just a couple of things. I obviously was not here at Chicago when John was here, but I have gotten to know him over the years in various capacities. The first was when I was studying for my orals and looking desperately for something to read about indigenous people in Brazil, and there was nothing out there. It was 93 going into 94, and just as I was beginning to think that John Hemming was going to be the only thing that I could find that would really make any sense of anything, John told me about John Montero's book, and I still remember, I don't remember all that many books that I read for my generals, but that one I remember so clearly because it had all of the hallmarks of the kind of scholarship that was being produced here at that time. It was the wrestling with sources, it was turning assumptions on their head, it was a kind of passion in the work, every kind of richness that you would expect to find in a wonderful piece of history. And so that was how I first met him. Then I had the fortune to be with one of the people in this picture, Barbara Summer, who is in several of these pictures, when both of us were doing our research in the archives in Rio de Janeiro. And she told me stories about Chicago at that time, and about John. They remained good friends up until the end of his life. And also about how she had come to the work that she continues to do on indigenous history in Brazil through him, and her respect for him just shone through. And then one of the first times that I met him was actually on the same highway where he died. He gave a couple of us a ride to the airport in Sao Paulo from Campinas. And the whole conversation was, and I wouldn't pretend to sort of represent his feelings about being here, but the whole conversation was about how much he had loved working with John and how much he had loved studying in Chicago. And obviously, that was what we had in common, so that's why it was the conversation. But it was an impression of this place that was so characteristic of him. It was, he had this very sort of ironic Brazilian air about him, and so it was never over the top, sweet, or whatever. But it was just so clear how much he'd learned here and how much he respected you, John. And he was just such a wonderful person, even to those of us that only had the chance to know him a few times over the many years. And it's so sad that he can't be here today.
Well, I was very fortunate. What I was doing with Soila and I went through to their field work, and we stayed for 3 years. And I went by circumstance. I was going to a conference in Sao Paulo, and a lot of people, and John probably said you should meet John Montero there. I was going to be in Sao Paulo for 10 days. And we had this, and it was at a sort of moment when we had a job in Cusco, and we were thinking of staying. And you always can find reasons not to why you should not write the dissertation. Don't graduate students don't listen to this. And John said he's really busy, but he'd meet for a quick beer at 6:30 in a certain place where a mutual friend dropped me off. We stayed till 10 o'clock at night. Only had like 2 beers. That was the amazing thing. And we just chatted and chatted. He had this incredible, I just remember it really well, because we've sort of stayed in touch. We've written it now and then about this, very critical of historiographies, of academic worlds, of all the BS, this and that, but at the same time very committed and very impressive command of arguments. Why what we do matters. This really matters. You have to take on the master narrative. Always question it. You have to be teaching undergraduates. It was really very, very influential for me. This is one. I actually wish we had recorded it. It was very breezy in a sense, but in this nice combination. It's really, by then, it become perfectly bicultural, bilingual. In a sense, he fit in very well. We stayed in touch for a couple of reasons. We had a mini project, never happened, but then we coincided. Dane's been in the Hispanic American Historical Editorial Boards, and he and I went to the same meeting. And he like his mentor, John Coatsworth, likes to jot stuff down. He'd have a pad, and it was great because I would sort of look over there and we'd agree, because it would be like, BS or not worth fighting about, but this is silly. And then at one point when the meeting got really long, he said, this makes Brazilian meetings look efficient, because we'd gone on and talked about, statistics about, and we chatted. But anyway, I was so excited. Emilia and I were excited to get him there, to get Brazil involved, to bring him back. And it was just such a terrible, terrible shock.
Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I'm Paulina Melo, and John Monteiro was my supervisor, advisor, and I would like to share with you that John was a really modest person. So probably he would not approve my comment about him, but John really changed the way to see Indians in Brazilian history. And he kept all the doors open to anthropology, linguistics, education, museology, and he was a really special person in Brazil, and he contributed a lot to our historiography. So I miss John too much.
Can I?
Yes.
My name is Ideologies. I'm also his student. And as Karina was telling you, as you are doing now, students love his teachers and always remember a lot of love this period of life. And we would like to say that in Brazil, hundreds of students are missing him now, and we are trying to find a way to move on, and we're gonna need the help of every one of you, because John was doing a hard work there, showing how important was research about this theme. So I think what he will appreciate is talk about Indians in places you are teaching or studying, and listen more about this subject. I think he probably will tell you now, maybe, but I don't know. And we are really sorry about everything, and thank you for accept us here to talk about this today.
And we're here because of John. And when we told him, oh John, we want to go to the University of Chicago to learn how you could make such a work about Indians in São Paulo, he was like this, oh really? Like he didn't know how we loved the way John used it to research and deal with person, and he was a really modest guy, like I told you before. So, but we can waste even we can waste his effort. So we have to moving on, and we have a lot of work to do. We have job to do, and maybe we can help us to do this job, discussing more about Indians and Americans, about social history, this kind of thing that we like.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you, Dane. I guess, in a way, this is, although in a sadder context, another example of what we've been talking about here the last 2 days, about these long multi-generational chains of learning and obligations and gratitude and conversations. And now we come to the last part of this wonderful, I think you all agree, gathering to remember, to celebrate, and to honor, and to reflect on the legacies of those decades when the University of Chicago became, I think I would say rather immodestly, one of the top programs training historians of Latin America anywhere in the world. Now, and so we ask in a moment John Coatsworth, who's been sitting there patiently and listening to people talk about him and Friedrich for the last day and a half, to have a chance to say what he wishes. Now, we said yesterday when the meeting started that we thought this was taking place at a happy and auspicious moment for Latin American history at the University of Chicago. We had the fortune of having the new dean of the division come and welcome you here. It's, I think, an optimistic moment for us. And So along the same lines, and I think as a sign both of the importance that the university and the department plays on what you started, and we do our best to continue carrying on, and also I think as a sign of the impact that John had not only in Latin American history at Chicago, but really in the history department and the social sciences division as a whole. We have here today, who's just arrived, Bruce Cummings, who is the current chair of the history department here at Chicago, a very distinguished and well-known scholar of East Asian history, who in fact had to be out of town for other obligations and insisted to fly back to Chicago just today so he could be here with us and have the opportunity to introduce John. I think it's both a tribute, I hope, I know, to John's impact, lasting impact. We still talk every now and then in those meetings about the Coatsworth reforms, whatever they were. I don't know, I wasn't here. But also, I think to the strength and the vitality of Latin American history at Chicago today, which, as I said, is really in large measure thanks to the amazing foundations that you all put together and that we continue to benefit from. So Bruce Cummings, to introduce John Coatsworth. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Emilio. John Coatsworth is the provost at Columbia, author or editor of 8 books, former president of the AHA, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellowship recipient, and most important, husband of Pat Coatsworth. But you knew all that. Instead of going on about John, I want to recall with fondness the history department meetings when he was chair 20 years ago. For example, I remember sitting across from Richard Helley during a department meeting. He made a typically reactionary remark and then said, "Oh well, I'm just a curmudgeon." And Barry Carl piped up and said, "No, you're not. You're just an old man." Or when Harry Haratunian made somewhat convoluted remark, and Prasenjit Dwara would leap forward and say, "What had he meant to say?" And then I would go have a drink with Harry, and he said, "I'm going to kill him. Next time he says it, I'm going to kill him." I see John is the only one getting this joke, but anyway. But what I don't understand is how John, as chair, inculcated such adoration from the department staff. On his 50th birthday, they got a big fake birthday cake and had a thinly clad girl jump out of it. And I'm waiting what they're going to do for me. Anyway, it's great to have John and Pat back in the John Hope Franklin room. But what I wish most is that Friedrich Katz could be with us, a great friend of Meredith and mine, your great friend, the epitome of a scholar and a gentleman. And what I said on his 80th birthday was that my wife, Meredith, her fondest desire is that I be more like Friedrich. Slow to anger. I never saw him angry. Be like Friedrich, just do your work and don't get involved in academic politics. Be unassuming like Friedrich. Be nice to graduate students, as Friedrich and I always tried to be. I'm sure John did too, since no one else is. But as my friend, he was also my secret mentor about life. After all, by following Friedrich, I don't get my wife, Meredith, angry. This is a wonderful conference, a Katzworth conference. We could never do the Najatunian conference. That would be Tetz Najata and Harry Haratunian. They weren't too happy with that appellation, but back in the good old days, 20 years ago, we had Katzworth, we had Najatunian. It was a wonderful department. And as far as Katzworth is concerned, 2 genuinely nice men who never let that get in the way of their considered scholarly judgment. Nice to introduce you, John.
So first, I want to say thanks to all of you for coming, to Bruce for flying back from Virginia, darkest Virginia, to Emilio and all of the folks at the Katz Center who brought us all here today. I think we are actually here mostly to celebrate the dawn of the Curie, Fisher, Borges, and Tenorio era at the University of Chicago, which I'm sure will be as brilliant as any in the past. It's a delight to be here, and I will send any graduate students that are really bright your way. It's especially wonderful to see how little changed former students are. I think almost everyone that I saw today and yesterday looks about the same and has exactly the same personality as the day that you walked in my office as first-year graduate students to begin with. It's just amazing how people don't change, even as they get more and more distinguished, as the books on their shelves they've written increase, and as the number of articles that are cited widely that becomes really impressive to the graduate students. The last 2 days reminded me of how special the years were that I spent at the University of Chicago with Friedrich, Katz, and with all of you. We often discussed how lucky we were. It was pretty clear we were getting the best students in the world. And what made that era so special in the history of the department and for us was working with so many amazing people. You'll notice that a number of the PhDs were awarded after I left. There was a sort of a backlog. I think the department counted 32 that in some way or another I was at least partly responsible for. It was a huge number of people. At one point, I think when we were putting together a grant proposal probably for the Title VI, we calculated that 10% of all of the PhDs in Latin American history in the US were awarded at Chicago in the 1980s. So it was a huge program. What made it feasible for just the two of us, plus don't forget T. Bentley Duncan, who helped with Brazilian history and taught a lot of the Latin American Civ course, what made it possible for us to do this is that most of our students were busy teaching each other. We had so many smart and amazing people around the table that Friedrich and I had to work a lot less than we might have otherwise. There was something, I think, special about the period, in addition to the amazing folks like you who came here. It's hard to understand what actually creates a scholarly generation, a sense of belonging and of common enterprise. I think several of you have alluded to the series of contingent factors that had to come together to make this a special experience for graduate students and especially for Friedrich and me. I think one way to start is by seeing if I can't get you to reach for your checkbooks. Since you've all had such a positive experience, you should know that Barbara Weinstein and I are chairing a committee of the American Historical Association which wants to name its annual prize for the best book in Latin American history after Friedrich Katz. And if you haven't gotten a Dunning letter from us yet, you will soon if you're a member of the AHA, and of course you should be. We're hoping to be able to raise the endowment that's required to make this a permanent prize, so that every year the best book in Latin American history, Latin American and Caribbean history, published in the English language, will be awarded the Friedrich Katz Prize. And I'm very delighted to say that the Katz family has contributed half of the cost of making this endowment possible, and a number of other people have begun contributing. So if you haven't gotten, if you haven't received a plea for funds in the mail yet, go to the AHA website and contribute whatever you have in your savings account. While the spirit of these last 2 days is still with you. I think one of the things that made this era so special for so many people, and especially for Friedrich and me, was the sense that we were living in terrible times. As Bruce Cummings knows so well, there were actually 2 Cold Wars fought from the end of World War II until the late 1980s. If you read the Cambridge history of the Cold War, it has 2 thick volumes, 3 actually. So you'll find those 3 thick volumes. You'll find 2 essays on Latin America, one of them on Cuba in the brief period between the Cuban Revolution and the missile crisis, and another in the last volume on the sort of recrudescence of the Cold War in Central America. The Cold War, for the most part, is missing. The Cold War in Latin America is missing from those 3 volumes, as it is from the consciousness of most historians who write about the history of the Cold War. But that's understandable, because there were actually 2 Cold Wars, as we all know. One of them was fought between the 2 superpowers, and because of mutually assured destruction and some careful diplomacy at points in time, that confrontation turned out not to be bloody at all. In fact, a long peace ensued in the Northern Hemisphere between the 2 superpowers that protected the United States and Europe. But if one looks at the Third World, it's a completely different history. And it's a different history in 2 senses. One, it's an extraordinary era of unprecedented violence at high levels of technology and with enormous numbers of victims. As near as I can tell from looking at the sources that should be able to have counted properly, there were far more victims of human rights abuse, of political assassination, of torture, and of disappearance in Latin America during the Cold War than there were in the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites, by an order of magnitude. So this is a part of the world, Latin America, as well as the and much of the rest of the Third World, a period of extraordinary violence. So that's the first point I wanted. The second is, in many of the conflicts in the Third World, including many in Latin America, the United States was on the wrong side. If you want to know why the apartheid regime in South Africa collapsed, you have to look at Soviet aid to the African National Congress and the Cuban Army's successful defeat of an invasion by the South African Army. It's the reason why Nelson Mandela went to Cuba on his first foreign trip after he was elected president of South Africa, of the new South Africa. And if you look at one conflict after another, it's clear that the pattern that was established in Latin America by American political elites to fight the Cold War, a pattern in which the United States allied with reliably anti-communist but usually quite right-wing and repressive regimes, was persisted throughout this period in our history. So when Friedrich and I came to Chicago, I came in 1969 and Friedrich in 1971. The historic context which brought us here was one in which thousands of Latin Americans were being killed every day as a result of that period of successive military coups that began in a major way with the Brazilian coup of 1964 and didn't really end until the final peace agreements that put an end to the Guatemalan conflict in 1996. So it was a period in which the Cold War was being fought and in which criticism of the foreign policy of this country was something that most Latin Americans took as part of the obligation of knowing something about the region. Somebody mentioned, I think on Friday, that the whole institutionalization of area studies in the United States occurred after World War II and somewhat a little bit for Latin American studies a bit later as a response to the Cold War and as a way of mobilizing intellectual firepower to help the United States win. It took the Cuban Revolution to get the Latin American Studies Association a lot of money coming to Latin American studies. And some of us have frequently felt really disappointed that the Sandinistas and Hugo Chavez weren't able to replicate that huge increase in funding that we all experienced in the 1960s. But both the people that founded the Latin American Studies Association and Latin Americanists in general were pretty critical of the policies pursued by the U.S. government. So that, in a sense, probably didn't distinguish us from colleagues in other institutions. What may have distinguished the Chicago program was the peculiar sensibilities, I think, that historical sensibilities that Friedrich and I shared, that Robin and others made reference to in the first panel. Friedrich and I were, and to some extent I think I clearly still am, Marxists of one kind or another. It's partly because of the experiences that each of us had had. Friedrich, as a communist during World War II and afterwards, a period in which there was considerable hope that socialism in Eastern Europe would produce a kind of society different and better than the German society that produced World War II. And there was a high regard for the Soviet Union as the principal combatant of the Nazis in that conflict. And there was the sensibilities of the anti-fascist struggles of the 1930s and 1940s as well. And I came from a student culture that had been fighting against nuclear weapons and for civil rights and against interventions in Latin America of various kinds long before I arrived at Chicago. I was present in Mexico City when what we think were hundreds of people were massacred in the Plaza del Tlatelolco. So this combination of a critical stance toward the Cold War policies of the U.S. government with a sense of distance that was sufficient to produce a high regard for, if not the domestic political and social and economic arrangements, certainly the foreign policy of our principal Cold War adversaries, was part of what brought us together. I think it was also the case that many of the historians that we admired most also thought of themselves as Marxists. So that may have created an environment that was different than elsewhere, both critical on the one hand, but in some significant sense, both theoretical and in terms of sensibilities, an approach or an adherence to a kind of Marxism that was certainly not dogmatic, but something that was important to both of us. It was a Marxism, I think, that was open, critical, materialist, scientific, empirical. It was a kind of Marxism that we admired in the West, that in which culture and ideas mattered, not in any mechanical sense, and always in a historical, always grounded in historical context, but it was part of the culture of at least portions of the American Academy and the Western European Academy that we felt closest to. And I think that was what made both Friedrich and I so quick to embrace political economy or political economic approaches to many of the issues that we were interested in studying. Now, as for activism, I know that for a number of years while we were here, the entire Department of Economics felt under siege from our graduate students. And I just wanted to say that we did absolutely nothing to put you all up to whatever it was you were up to. I do know from folks in the economics department that you had a considerable impact on the way they thought about what they were doing overseas. There was one point, I think, when some of you persuaded the student government at Chicago to hold hearings on the question whether the University of Chicago's reputation in Latin America had been damaged by the activities of some of our economists. And the economics department went into full hysteria. And the president at the time, who I believe was the acting president, John Wilson, ordered the student government not to hold the hearings, which we thought, at least to some extent, was a bit of a triumph, because it allowed us not just 1 week of denunciations of the economics department, but a whole month of denouncing the lack of academic freedom in Chicago. So I do remember a number of the activities that graduate students at Chicago were engaged in. I think it was Paul Gutenberg that was involved in organizing a massive, sort of filled a 3,500 seat auditorium downtown. I guess Pat was working on this too, for the Quilapayún folk singing group from Chile. And I was delegated because I was going to, at some point I think was going to Mexico to deliver the proceeds of the conference to the representatives of the Chilean opposition in exile. A number of graduate students of ours picketed the library, actually, when Pat was fired for union organizing, including Mark Wasserman, who wasn't able to be here today, but who's never been known for his political activism since, but was there carrying a picket sign. I have a picture to prove it. Activism was part of being a Latin Americanist in the 1970s and 1980s, I think. It was hard to be a Latin Americanist without feeling that there was something wrong that needed to be protested. The other part of being a Latin Americanist was to try and translate frustration with what was happening in Latin America into a career-long passion to tell the story of the region. Not in any sort of necessarily contemporary sense, but all of us believed, as many of us had believed during the Vietnam War, that if only Americans had known more about the region, they would have been able to, they would have helped in some way to prevent such destructive policies from being pursued by our government. Chicago was a special place. The University of Chicago is still a special place. I can tell you from having been at Harvard, at Columbia, it's the interdisciplinarity, which is part of the DNA of the University of Chicago, doesn't exist to the same extent elsewhere. It has something to do with poverty. Harvard has departments, and each department has a massive staff that guards the boundary. Harvard once had, until its recent financial crisis, 4 different programs, each of which was to get dedicated solely to teaching incoming freshmen how to write the English language, each with a coterie of faculty and staff, and each convinced that its own approach was the only one. Wealthy institutions, wealthier than Chicago, tend to defend the disciplinary boundaries better than Chicago could. I think it's probably still the case that if you go into the office of the Dean of the Division of Social Sciences in Chicago with a good idea and another colleague, the dean won't have any money, but it'll be defenseless against whatever project that you want to propose to him. So the fact that we had a wonderful anthropology department, great colleagues in political science, and in other departments of the social sciences and elsewhere, was a huge advantage to all of the students who were here, as some of you have said. I actually found common ground with a number of economists with whom I remained. I had very cheerful relations. Robert William Fogel, who won the Nobel Prize with Doug North in 1994, was himself the former head of the youth branch of the American Communist Party, and had a sort of political economic sensibility that one wouldn't find so easily in an economics department nowadays. Doug North actually was mentioned as an economic historian of that era, was a Trotskyist who organized restaurant workers in St. Louis, as I gather. So there was a sensibility about issues of institutions and of policy and of the importance of economics, studying major issues outside of the narrow confines of the discipline that existed in economics departments in the U.S. and especially at Chicago at that time, that I think the intervening years have tended to reduce. Economics departments have tended towards math and theory They don't teach economic thought, history of economic thought any longer. There are many departments that have no economic historians. One of them is at Columbia. In some departments, the whole field of behavioral economics has passed them by, not theoretical enough. But the pendulum is swinging back the other way, I think, in economics. And so I'm hopeful that at Chicago as elsewhere, historians who are interested in economics will find more willing partners and some interesting methods that could be applied from colleagues in economics departments. As to the future of history, economic history, or political economy, I'm reminded of a story about Albert Einstein. After he came to the United States, he tended to travel from place to place by train because he didn't like airplanes. One time he was traveling on a train, and a young ticket taker came to get his ticket, and he began reaching into his pockets, and he couldn't find the tickets. And the ticket taker recognized him and said, "Oh, never mind, Dr. Einstein, I know who you are. You don't need to find your ticket." But Einstein kept reaching in his pockets and finally got on the floor and began looking underneath the seat. So the young man repeated what he had said. "Dr. Einstein, you really don't need to find your ticket. It's okay." Whereupon Einstein turned around and looked up at it and said, "Young man, it's not a question of the ticket. It's a question of where I am going." So I remember a phrase from one of the impenetrable writings of Ernesto Laclau that somebody mentioned earlier. He referred to the era after the collapse of the Soviet Union and of various macro historical models of how the world works as post-utopian, but still emancipatory. I think some of the issues that we've talked about earlier in this interesting conversation about the future of history and the future of Latin American history are exactly the right ones. This is a different era. Latin America is in a fundamentally different place than it was during that long nightmare of military regimes and economic backwardness and slowed the non-existent economic growth. But there are still immense problems in the region that an approach like those that you represented in the last 2 days could be extraordinarily helpful. So I just want to say congratulations to all of you. You've been enormously successful after leaving Chicago. I don't attribute much of that to my own efforts or even to Friedrich's. We just had an enormous advantage. We admitted the best students in the world, and you're the best historians of Latin America in the world. So it seems almost natural that this should have happened without any other intervention at all. So finally, thanks. I realize that I'm the only thing that stands between you and the bar. So thanks again to Emilio and to all of you for coming.